Hi, everybody. Great to see so many of you out there this evening. Thank you for joining us for this rescheduled event, and thank you for those of us who signed up to do this a few weeks ago. We appreciate your cooperation and understanding and agreeing with us that rescheduling was the right thing to do. And here we are finally with our evening with Betsy Maguire and William Kent Krueger, who goes by Kent, so Betsy will be referring to him by Kent as we go through the evening. We're so grateful to have both of them here. I'm Jennifer LaRue. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at Mark Twain House and Museum. And I say here because here is wherever you say here is these days. We have been doing all of our public programs via Crowdcast and having wonderful audiences like you all tonight. So again, we're grateful for your support and enthusiasm. We are excited to report that the Mark Twain House and Museum will be opening its doors to the public, live people coming for tours on June 20th, and we are sold out for our first day. So we're very grateful for that too. And we hope to see you here very soon. I just want to tell you about a couple things before I hand things off to Betsy and Kent. First of all, these times have been very trying. The Mark Twain House has kept very active and engaged with these public programs, but your support is very, very important to us. And it's especially important right now because we are participants and beneficiaries of the wonderful Travelers Championship Birdies for Charity program. And if you notice that green bar beneath Kent on the screen, or maybe it's between, I don't know who it's behind, beneath right now, but that calls your attention to the Birdies for Charity opportunity. Any gift that you make, large, small, in between, gets added to by 15%. And that's a real boost and a real help to the Mark Twain House. And so I encourage you, if you are considering making a donation, to do it now while that 15% addition is in play. And I'm noticing that there are an awful lot of Mark Twain House staff and trustees in the chat area tonight. I'd like to invite them to say hi and identify themselves so people know who's out there. And just on behalf of the entire staff of the Mark Twain House and the Board of Trustees, I want to let you know that, again, any donation you're able to make, large or small or in between, is deeply appreciated and is really making a huge difference, more than you probably can imagine right now. So thank you for that. Another thing you can pay attention to throughout the talk is that we have a link up to buy a copy of Kent's most recent novel that we'll be talking about tonight, This Tender Land. So I'll be behind the scenes. I'm going to hide for a few minutes once Kent and Betsy start talking, and I will continue to make that opportunity to purchase that book available to you. And just to make sure you understand that it's a signed copy, which makes it all the more special. And your purchase through our museum store benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. So I'm not going to keep you too much longer. I just want to tell you about a couple of upcoming programs. But before I do, I'm just looking at the attendance numbers. And as one of our interpreters has pointed out, who's in the audience, this is more people than we can fit in our auditorium live over there. So that's just thrilling. Kind of gives me a little chill. June 24th, we have a wonderful program similar to this. We're going to be talking with Gretchen Soren, and she'll be in conversation with Kimberly Kersey, talking about Gretchen's recent book, Driving While Black. And that's a kind of a scholarly book in some ways, but also intertwines and interweaves her own personal experiences growing up during the era where Black people had to really make a lot of calculated decisions about travel and had to choose their cars very carefully and, follow the Green Book for places that Black people were welcome along the way. It's fascinating. It's a great book. And Kimberly is the new director of the Amistad Center for Art and Culture at the Wadsworth Atheneum. So we're delighted to bring her on board for that conversation. So that's on the 24th. On the 25th, we have the next in our Trouble at Home series, which is the online extension of our Trouble Begins at 5:30. And we're going to be talking, Steve Courtney, our wonderful Steve Courtney, who some of you know, will be talking with Alan Rankin, who kind of by accident came across a diary written by a teenage girl and got fascinated. And that teenage girl, who had long been gone, turned out to be Mark Twain's granddaughter, Nina, daughter of his own middle daughter, Clara. And so he's learned so much and has written quite a bit about Nina, and actually taught us all a lot about who Nina was, because she wasn't that well known to us, and we all expect to learn a lot more then. So I hope we'll see you in the audiences for both of those. And then finally, I just want to let you know that we are taking a big plunge in running our Writers Weekend on Crowdcast. Rather than reschedule it for the fall or winter like so many other writing conferences are doing, we've decided, you know what, let's just be adventuresome. So on July 10th through 12th, we're going to be holding our Writers Weekend. We have Scott Dickers, founding editor of The Onion, as one of our keynote speakers. We have Mike Reese, longtime head writer for The Simpsons. And we have Sophronia Scott, who is a wonderful novelist, who will be giving our keynote speech on Friday night. Amy Bloom, just tons and tons of people. It's all up on our website. And the cost for the weekend is $75, which I don't think you can beat too easily. So if you are interested at all, we invite you to register for that. Having said all that, I want to introduce Betsy Maguire, who is a friend, first of all, and a longtime colleague. And she actually created the Living History program at the Mark Twain House and Museum, which is a program in which actors costume themselves and assume the roles of Mark Twain's family and friends and household staff, and conduct the tours in the first person using the actual words of the people they represent. And it's just been a wonderful addition to our offerings. And maybe Betsy will have a moment to talk a tiny bit more about that at some point. She's also the winner of the Connecticut Stories on Stage. She's a playwright, focusing mostly, Betsy, right, on writing for museums and historical societies.
That's right. Yep.
And this is awesome that you were the 2019 recipient of the Excellence in Playwriting Award from the International Museum Theater Alliance. So that's awesome. And we're so glad to have you both here. Betsy wanted to do the honors of introducing Kent. So I'm going to disappear. I'm just going to encourage you to, if you have questions, which I assume you will, please post them in that Ask a Question area at the bottom of your screen. They won't be considered if they're in the chat area. So please take a moment to put them over there. And I will pop back on toward the end of our talk and go through those questions with Betsy and Kent. So welcome, both of you. Thanks so much. And thank you to everybody who's here. And I'm going to pop away. Have fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank Jennifer, because I am so thrilled to be here tonight with William Kent Krueger. He is a New York Times best-selling author and a multi-award winner. So many awards, we don't really have time to go through them all, but I did want to mention he is the recipient of the Edgar Award for Best Novel of 2013, and that is given by the Mystery Writers of America. But tonight we're going to talk about a book that was published last year, This Tender Land, and it has been favorably compared to the works of Charles Dickens and Sinclair Lewis and L. Frank Baum, the epic poet Homer, and our very own Mark Twain. So that's quite a lot. Thank you so much, Kent, for being here tonight.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you this evening, Betsy.
I can't wait to explore some of these things. Yes.
Now, Jennifer indicated I should caution everybody up front. I am in St. Paul, Minnesota. The sky is just about to crack open, and God is just about to wreak all havoc on us. So if you hear lots of thunder in the background, that's what's going on.
All right. Well, hopefully that won't happen till after 8 o'clock, but we'll see. Eastern time. We shall see. So I would like to begin at the beginning. I would like to tell everyone that in This Tender Land, if you haven't read it, and I hope you all do, the hero of the book, a young boy named Odie O'Banion, like Kent, is a master storyteller. So I would love for you to talk about a little bit about your growing up years and how you began the journey to become this wonderful teller of tales.
Sure. Well, I was a gypsy kid when I was growing up. My family moved around an enormous amount for reasons I won't go into. But the bottom line on that is we were just a very unpopular family. So I never really had any place to call home. And all of those what all of those travels really did for me was to give me, I lived in cities, I lived in small towns, I lived on farms, to give me a broad sense of America in all its aspects, which I continue to draw on enormously in all of my writing. The place I probably loved living most were the years that I spent in my adolescence in the Midwest. And now I live in St. Paul because the Midwest drew me back. I heard the siren call and I couldn't resist. So I've been back in the Midwest now for 40 years or so. I began my writing a very, very, very long time ago. In fact, I have always written. I blame my parents for that. When I was a kid, I had parents. I hope, like you and like lots of people out there listening, had parents who read to me when I was a child. When I was a kid, I never went down for a nap, never went to bed at night without a story being read to me. So I grew up thinking of the world in terms of stories and always wanted to be one of the storytellers. Can I tell a quick story in that regard?
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, say no to me, right?
Yes.
So, the first short story I remember writing was a short story in the 3rd grade. It was called The Walking Dictionary. I got to tell you this, my father was a high school English teacher. And I don't know if there are any English teachers out there in the audience, but my father, the high school English teacher, when I was a kid, was always storming around the house ranting something like, nobody uses dictionaries enough, nobody uses dictionaries enough. So in the 3rd grade, I wrote a short story called The Walking Dictionary, which was in fact about a dictionary that didn't think it was being used enough. It magically sprouted legs so that it could toddle off into the world and go to the people that needed it. My 3rd grade teacher went gaga over that story. My folks who would have known over that story. I swear to God, Betsy, in the 3rd grade, I knew I was.
Do you still have it?
I do not.
You do not. I bet you could recreate that.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I could recreate the voice of that kid in the 3rd grade.
Well, you write children very well, so I'm sure you can do that. One of the first things I read about you as I was doing research was that you were kicked out of Stanford University. And then I later saw an interview with you, and you very proudly said that. It was not something you were going to shirk away from. And I remember reading it and smiling and thinking, Mark Twain would have approved of that. And then when I read why and what the radical activity was, I sort of doubled down on that thought. So if you don't mind telling us a little bit about that.
No, this is a story I'm, as you say, kind of proud to tell because I was kicked out of Stanford for all the right reasons. I matriculated at Stanford in the fall of 1969. This is deep during the Vietnam conflict, one of the most divisive experiences our nation has gone through in probably since the Civil War, although we're seeing a great deal of division these days, particularly over the immigration issue. But back then, Vietnam was the issue. Stanford at that point in time had a relationship with an organization called the Stanford Research Institute, whose primary source of income was research in military weaponry. There were a lot of us at Stanford who felt that was an inappropriate relationship for an institution like Stanford to maintain, particularly at that point in history. So we, petitioned the trustees, the administration, everybody we could to sever that relationship. But there was an enormous amount of money involved. So of course, nobody listened to us. We marched, we did all kinds of things. And finally, we one day marched into the administration building and occupied it. The president at that point, a guy named Richard Lyman, was pretty reasonable. He said, fine, I'm not going to give you a hassle. He cleared the building and we took it over. That night at 8 o'clock, we had a band come in and we held a dance where typically we would have been registering for classes. About midnight, the band packed up and took off, and those of us who were going to occupy rolled out our sleeping bags. And at 1 o'clock, while we were all sleeping, the Palo Alto riot squad swept through and arrested us. I was on a scholarship. They yanked my scholarship, so I had to leave Stanford. But I have to tell you, when I called my folks and told them what was going on, my dad said, I have never been more proud of you. Yeah, so it was for me, it was just a terrific experience. And honestly, Betsy, I've always thought it was a whole lot more interesting to tell people that I was kicked out of Stanford.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, absolutely. So you made your dad proud, and it's a great story you can tell and retell.
There you go.
That's one that'll be handed down. That's wonderful. That's great. So we are here to talk about This Tenderland, but I do want to mention your very popular Cork O'Connor mystery series. From what I understand, it was started in 1998, and you will be releasing your 18th in the series. Is that right? Next year? That's the plan?
Yeah, I just completed the first drafts. I'm working with my agent and editor on revisions. It will be released in the fall of 2021. That's
Okay.
correct.
So as the son of an English teacher, I would like you to tell us how I think I heard you once say that he called it literature with a capital L. So how did you come to write mysteries? How did you settle on that genre?
Sure. So when I was 18 years old, my father, the high school English teacher, insisted I read Ernest Hemingway, and I fell madly in love with Hemingway. And for way too long, tried to write the great American novel as Hemingway might have written it. Stupid on so many levels. When I hit 40, I kind of entered a period of a midlife crisis and said, the hell with writing the great American novel. I want to write something somebody might actually want to read. So I looked around me to see what people read. And you know what everybody reads, Betsy? Everybody reads mysteries. Exactly. The genre whose appeal cuts across all socioeconomic levels. So I decided I'm going to write a mystery. But, so here's a confession coming from a mystery writer. Before I began to write mysteries, I didn't read them. And the influence of my father, the high school English teacher, who believed that mysteries were the poor stepchildren of literature.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I didn't even read Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys growing up. I had a lot to learn. So actually, I took a class. Here in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, we have this marvelous resource called The Loft. It's the largest independent center devoted to the written word in the United States. So I took a class at The Loft, which was basically Mystery Writing 101.
That's awesome.
It worked. I wrote the first chapter from the first published Cork O'Connor novel in that class. And what I discovered is I love mysteries. I love the fact that there's a structure to a story. For anybody out there who thinks mysteries are formulaic, they aren't. But there is a structure to mysteries. And it goes something like this. In a mystery, typically speaking, it will begin with something happening. Very often, usually it's a crime, very often it's a murder. Investigation follows and answers are found. That's it. Very simple structure. Something happens, investigation follows, and answers are found. But within that very simple structure, a writer is free to do anything he or she wants to do. So I often use my novels to talk about important social issues. And I've discovered that as long as I couch my social issues in the context of a good, compelling mystery,
Absolutely.
even if you don't necessarily agree with my point of view, still read me.
Right. And not that it needs to be elevated, but that can elevate any book. Somebody feeling about an issue and weaving it into that story.
Yeah, I love mysteries, and I will always write mysteries. I am happy to be moving out and expanding what I write with Ordinary Grace and now This Tender Land.
Yes. So Ordinary Grace, I have to tell you, I read it in a day. I started it in the morning, and I didn't put it down until I was finished. I absolutely loved it. I want to read this quote because I think it's wonderful. Someone called it, where is this? Here it is. A coming-of-age murder mystery relationship primer dealing with grief, finding faith kind of book. And I thought that was just wonderful. Every word in that is very important and really speaks to what kind of a book it is. The story of Frank Drum, and it, for our audience tonight, it takes place 30 years after This Tender Land. It's a 1961. It's set. So before we get into This Tender Land, tell us a little bit about Ordinary Grace, and then how you dealt with the great success of that book, and how that informed what your next step was.
Well, we're talking a significant journey here.
Yeah.
For those of you who have no idea what Ordinary Grace is all about, here it is in a nutshell. It takes place in the summer of 1961. It's set in a small town deep in the very beautiful Minnesota River Valley. It's the story of a Methodist minister whose beloved child is murdered. That's the compelling mystery component to the novel. But at heart, it's really the story of what that terrible tragedy does to this man's faith, his family, and ultimately the entire fabric of this small town in which he lives. I have to tell you, when I first proposed that project to my publisher, they weren't particularly excited about it. They pretty much told me they only wanted Cork O'Connor novels from me. But it was a story that was so compelling to me, I had to write it. And when I finished the manuscript 3 years later, even though my publisher told me they didn't really want it, I went ahead and sent it to my editor at Simon & Schuster. She fell in love with it. She said, of course, we're going to publish it. And they did. And Ordinary Grace has had just this really remarkable, really gratifying reception from readers. Like it won tons of awards.
That was brave of you, by the way, to spend 3 years writing something that your publisher said they didn't want.
Yeah, but you're an artist, right?
Yeah.
You write what you're compelled to write. You don't, the money is nice, but you don't write for the money. You write because of what it does for you inside. This story spoke to me in a way that I knew I couldn't turn away from it.
It's really beautiful.
So the book has done incredibly well. It's been translated into a couple of dozen languages now. It's so far sold nearly 1 million copies. So when my publishers saw how well that book was doing, boy, did they want another book just like it.
Yeah.
I signed a contract for a companion novel. That manuscript was contractually due to my publisher 5 years ago. 2 months before the contractual deadline, I set up a meeting in Chicago to talk to my agent about revisions to the piece because there were problems with it. I knew it, she knew it. 2 days before we met, I sent her a note saying, when we get together, I don't want to talk about how we revise this piece. I want to talk about how we keep it from being published. Because it wasn't the story I'd imagined it would be. I didn't know how to make it that story. And frankly, my heart wasn't in it anymore. My publisher was actually very understanding. They said, fine, you don't have to give us this manuscript, but you still owe us a companion novel. So here's what was happening there, Betsy. The expectations for that follow-up novel were just enormous. And the whole time I was trying to write the story, I just felt crushed by the weight of all those expectations. But as soon as the weight got lifted off my shoulders and I felt free again, I really saw so clearly the story I should have been writing. And it was a story I've been wanting to write since I was 11 years old.
Wow.
The updated version of Huckleberry Finn.
Isn't that interesting? And it had nothing to do with the work that you spent 3 years creating. Unrelated.
No, that. I may come back to it at some point when I have a better sense of how to write that particular story.
Wow. All right. So this Tenderland, I know many of you have read it and loved it as I did. I am going to start by asking Kent, if you have your copy handy, if you would please read the prologue to us.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you want me to give the elevator version so I can set the
Sure. Yes, please do.
Okay.
Please do. And then you can put it into context for us.
Sure. This Tenderland is the story of, it's set deep in the Great Depression in the summer of 1932. It's the story of 4 orphans running from the law because they've committed a terrible crime, but for the right reason. They know if they take to the roads to get away, they'll be caught quickly because a huge manhunt has been launched to capture them. They're afraid to ride the rails as everybody was doing back in the Depression because the railroads back then were patrolled by private cops called bulls. And the bulls had a reputation for being incredibly cruel. So the kids are afraid to ride the rails. Instead, they decide to take to the rivers. They canoe a river called the Gilead to the Minnesota. They canoe the Minnesota River to the Mississippi, and their plan is to canoe all the way down the Mississippi River to St. Louis, where they believe they have family and they'll be safe. As I said, I've always wanted to write an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. This is my Huckleberry Finn. So I love reading the prologue, by the way, for 2 reasons. It's very short. It's just over a page long. But the other reason I like reading this prologue is that I absolutely love this prologue. Thank you for asking me to read it.
I do too. Yeah. Thank you for reading it.
Yeah, this is how I bring readers into this tender land. In the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and sea, and all living things that dwell therein, after he created man and woman, and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. I am a storyteller. I live in a house in the shade of a sycamore tree on the banks of the Gilead River. My great-grandchildren, when they visit me here, call me old. Old is a cliche, I tell them with mock disappointment, a terrible trivializing, an insult. I was born along with the sun and earth and moon and planets and all the stars. Every atom of my being was there at the very beginning. You're a liar, they scowl but playfully. Not a liar, a storyteller, I remind them. Then tell us a story, they plead. I need no goading. Stories are the sweet fruit of my existence, and I share them gladly. The events I'm about to share with you began on the banks of the Gilead. Even if you grew up in the heartland, you may not remember these things. What happened in the summer of 1932 is most important to those who experienced it, and there are not many of us left. The Gilead is a lovely river. lined with cottonwoods already ancient when I was a boy. Things were different then, not simpler or better, just different. We didn't travel the way we do now, and for most folks in Fremont County, Minnesota, the world was limited to the piece of it they could see before the horizon cut off the land. They wouldn't have understood any more than I did that if you kill a man, you are changed forever. If that man comes back to life, you are transformed. I have witnessed this and other miracles with my own eyes. So among the many pieces of wisdom life has offered me over all these years is this: open yourself to every possibility, for there is nothing your heart can imagine that is not so. The tale I'm going to tell is of a summer long ago, of killing and kidnapping and children pursued by demons of 1,000 names. There will be courage in this story and cowardice. There will be love and betrayal. And of course, there will be hope. In the end, isn't that what every good story is about?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm
You're
sure
welcome.
all of our audience enjoyed that immensely. So now I have a question I wasn't expecting to ask you. Do you ever consider doing your own Audible books, in your own voice? Because you haven't, I don't think.
Yes, I haven't, but I auditioned and was turned down.
Is that right?
That's right.
Wow. An author has to audition for their own book.
Well, here's the deal, Betsy. When I expressed an interest in reading my own material, they said, "Fine, come on out. We'll give you a test." So I went out to the headquarters. They put me in a booth. They opened the book that I had just put out and said, "Okay, go ahead and read." Mm-hmm. So I read from the beginning, and it was exposition mostly in the beginning of that particular novel, and I read exposition pretty well. And then they said, "Okay, now turn to another place we marked." And I turned to a section that they had marked that contained dialogue between a number of people. And suddenly I realized why they have professional narrators do this stuff, because my men sounded exactly like my women, my children sounded like my adults. And you know, a good narrator creates unique voices for all of the characters. And here's what strikes me as the genius part of this: they maintain those voices throughout the whole course of the work. I could never do that. I could never.
Okay. Well, you read your prologue very well. So.
Well, thank you. I do a nice prologue.
So as you introduced, 4 orphans on this life-changing odyssey, this sprawling book. 2 of the children are brothers. And I think you have a close relationship with your brother. And I was wondering, these 2 boys, Odie and Albert, are very different from each other in your book. I was wondering if there was anything that you brought from your own life into these 2 boys.
Yeah, my brother and I are very different. I'm smarter and handsomer. I hope he's not watching. Yes, I brought my everything I learned about being the youngest brother. I had 2 older brothers actually growing up, a younger sister.
So you were the older.
So yes, I know what it's very much what it's like to have an overbearing older brother. And in fact, I have used both of my brothers in Ordinary Grace and in This Tender Land. In Ordinary Grace, the relationship that Frank Drum has with his brother Jake is very much like the relationship I had with my next oldest brother. In This Tender Land, Odie's brother Albert, I based loosely on my oldest brother, who was a guy who was always the smartest in the class, and he certainly let you know it. And he was just well versed in so many things, and he had kind of a rigid moral code. So yeah, and he wanted to be an athlete, but he just didn't have what it takes. But I loved him dearly, and so I used him sort of as the template for Albert in the creation of Odie's older brother.
Well, their relationship and how I won't do any spoilers on this, but it's really nice to read their story. And then we have Emmy, a young girl. I think she's 5 or 6. as they begin this, and that's challenging, I imagine, to write in such a young voice, beautifully done, seamless to me. Was that? Did you struggle with that at all? Was that difficult to write such a young character?
Actually, no. I should say yes. I really struggled with it.
Yeah, no. Maybe it just came natural. I would find that challenging.
Do you know, the voices, who each of these characters is, came to me in such a deep, kind of mystical way. I knew these kids right away. Although I have to say this about Emmy. Emmy came kind of late to the game. I had created her primarily to be the daughter for Cora Frost, a teacher at the school, because I imagined Cora Frost to be the kind of woman who would have a child. And so I gave her a daughter, Emmy. And the more Emmy appeared in the scenes that I was writing, the more I liked her. And it came to the point where the boys are going to leave the Native American boarding school, and realized that I had left Emmy in such a precarious situation that I couldn't really do that. And I thought, well, she's got to go with these boys on this long epic journey that they're going to embark on. So I had to come up with a kind of a part for Emmy to play in this story.
Yeah.
And she, as you point out, she's only 6, but because of the way I imagined her and the part that I imagined her to play in this story, she is wise beyond her years. So one of the things that I know from all of the epics that my father insisted that my high school English teaching father insisted that I read is that on epic journeys, heroes and heroines often are accompanied by a seer, someone who can look into the future and offer advice, whether it's accepted or not. And so I thought, okay, Emmy will be my seer.
Yeah.
So she had an important role to play. But she was very easy to write. And because the story is told in Odie's voice, it's really Odie's voice who informs the reader of everyone in the story.
Sure.
Actually, not difficult at all to create Emmy in what I believed was an acceptable, believable, understandable way.
Yeah, good. And what a seer she was. And then the fourth is a boy, a teenager named Mose, who is the most victimized of the 4. You describe their time, and we'll get to this next, the Indian boarding school where they all sort of met up, as soul crushing, their time there. But his life was quite tragic, and he does not speak at all in this book.
He's mute.
He is mute.
And there's a reason he's mute.
There is a reason. I don't know if you want to say, but
Sure.
That was also interesting to see. Sometimes when writers read other writers, we try to see how did they go about doing this, or what choices were made and why. And I found that also very interesting, to write a character who's not going to speak.
Yeah, although speak he does.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's very eloquent with his sign language.
Yes, and you could picture it so well.
So Mose is mute. And Mose is mute because Mose represents something much larger than himself. He represents a native culture that had no voice. The Native American boarding schools, which I believe we're going to talk about next, was just another example of a situation in which the white majority, imposed its will on the indigenous people here, and they had nothing to say about it. So I decided Mose is going to be mute, and he will stand for this whole culture. And though he's been victimized, we see him right away as this huge-hearted, very generous, likable kid, powerful young man. And some of that is because he simply doesn't have an idea who he is. And across the course of this journey that he embarks on with the other vagabonds, he begins to understand his heritage, where he came from, the importance of the culture, his culture. And he begins to find a stronger, more powerful voice for himself. I don't want to give a lot away, but I love the journey of Mose across the course of this story.
Absolutely.
He's the most complex character, I think, in the whole affair.
For sure. I mean, you cannot read this book and not just fall in love with him. And this was something really I was not aware of. It's probably embarrassing to admit, but I had no idea that these Indian boarding schools existed, hundreds, government funded. Kids were abused if they tried to speak their native language. Kill the Indian, save the man. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, the Native American boarding school system was the misguided brainchild of a guy named Colonel Richard Henry Pratt. He convinced the government to allow him to open a boarding school for Native boys, young men in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And the government deemed it such a successful project that they embarked on creating similar boarding schools across the country. At its peak, I think there were like 360 Native American boarding schools across the country. Some operated by the government, many operated by private organizations, but all based on Pratt's idea, which was kill the Indian, save the man. He firmly believed that the only way for natives to survive was if they got rid of their culture and were assimilated, became essentially white. So kids who went into the boarding school, they were stripped of their native clothing. They were washed in kerosene or lye soap to remove vermin. In many native traditions, long hair is a sacred element, and all of these kids had their long hair shorn off. They were given prison uniforms. They weren't allowed to speak their language or practice their traditional religions. If they did so, they risked incredibly horrible punishments. Yeah.
It's a really shameful chapter that I don't remember learning about in school.
Well, my Cork O'Connor series deals with a man who is of mixed heritage. He's part Irish American and he's part Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, which is the largest tribal affiliation in northern Minnesota. So I've been aware of, because I've been writing about that culture for 20 years now. I've been aware of the boarding school system for a very long time, but I have never really delved deeply into it. In order to create the environment as realistically as I could for this tender land, I had to do an enormous amount of research. And I read so many first-person accounts of survivors of that experience that it just shocked me. One of the things that I hoped, though, is that, like you, many white readers who had no idea of this tragic period of history would be enlightened. And
absolutely,
once again, ashamed by what our forebears did.
Yeah, really something. So you talk about research. I'd love to hear what were some of the things you researched? I do remember hearing that you actually got, is it a canoe or a kayak, and you tried to follow much of the route that the kids followed. Is that true?
Yeah, a kayak, that section of the Minnesota River, the kids kayak.
That's great.
And my wife and I canoed that section of the Mississippi that the kids canoe. And that was enlightening in many respects. When we were canoeing the Mississippi, it happened to be a particularly busy day for barge traffic. And the barges leave huge wakes, and we were afraid we were going to be on occasions. Yeah, well, I visited all the places that the kids spend time in order to make sure that I got the sense of the places correct. I researched the period of the Depression here, particularly here in Minnesota, by going back and reading countless microfilmed newspapers of the time. I read lots of first-person accounts by people who here in Minnesota who survived the Depression, both in the city and in the rural setting and in small towns. I read accounts of people who took to the rails, became, bums during the Depression. Did everything that I could to understand that period of time and create it realistically for the reader.
Yeah, that must have been fun.
It was a lot of fun, and eye-opening in so many ways.
Of course. I remember hearing that Mark Twain once said, I never wrote a character I didn't meet along the Mississippi River. And I was picturing you sort of making your way and just formulating in your head what you were going to write. So let's talk a little bit about rivers, because I told you before, I love the subject of rivers. I grew up next to a river. As a kid, I spent a lot of time next to rivers and on rivers and crossing rivers and swinging vines. And it's just ripe for make-believe and adventure. And I just pictured these kids on a river during this book. It was so easy for me to picture their adventuresome spirit and their bravery and being scared and the whole thing. So river, I think, is probably a big metaphor in this book. So talk a little bit about the river.
Yeah, a river can be a metaphor for so many things, and it's actually a metaphor in this particular novel for many things.
Yeah.
It's certainly a metaphor for the journey the kids take from a particular understanding about the world to a much broader understanding of the world. Odie really moves into his manhood as a result of this river journey. All of the kids um, come to a greater understanding of themselves and their particular gifts and talents and maybe purpose in life. It's certainly a metaphor for the spiritual journey because all of the kids are on a spiritual journey, particularly Odie, who's really struggling to embrace the nature of God. And he's given so many divergent images of what God is, the tornado God, the destructive God in the Old Testament versus the more loving, accepting, forgiving God that he's introduced to in one section of the book by the wonderful Sister Eve.
Loved that character.
Oh, God, I love Sister Eve too.
Oh, wow. Talk about her a little bit. Was she based on Amy Semple McPherson? I read that somebody said, oh, she must have been based on her a little bit, or was this, how common was this, these revival tent shows?
Yeah, there was a huge tent revival movement that began in the early part of the 20th century. By the Depression, it had pretty much died down in the rest of the country, but was still very strong in the South and in the Midwest. So you had lots of tent revival groups, tent healers moving through the country, just like Sister Eve. I actually based her kind of on Sharon Falconer in Elmer Gantry, Sinclair Lewis's Elmer Gantry.
Yeah, that's where the comparison comes from.
Sharon Falconer is a woman in that novel, is a woman of the world, but she is a woman who profoundly believes that she's been tapped by God to bring His loving grace to the population, and that's pretty much Sister Eve. She is definitely a woman of the world, and she's a woman who I loved writing Sister Eve.
Oh, I can imagine.
I wanted the reader not to be sure at all who she was for a very long time. So yeah, and I did my research on Amy Semple McPherson, Billy Sunday, all of the great revival ministers back in the day.
Yeah, those sections were fun. And how she sort of revealed herself to Odie, and in very measured ways. She was actually a lovely character. I thought she was really.
Do you know, one of the things I wrote Sister Eve as a result of what I know about writing a good mystery. When you write a good mystery, it's all about when you reveal the truths. And so that slow reveal of the truths helps the reader, holds the reader in suspense, but eventually, I hope, delivers to the reader the payoff that all of that suspense promises.
Yeah. So you have this wonderful acknowledgement and author's notes. So we're going to talk about your acknowledgements. I loved it's short, but you mentioned Red Wing shoes, which to an East Coast girl meant nothing to me. So I did a little research. Tell us about Red Wing shoes and why you thanked them in your.
Sure. I got married in a pair of Red Wing boots that I picked up in a Goodwill store, along with a suit that I picked up in a Goodwill store. So I have a soft spot in my heart for Red Wing shoes. Red Wing, the Red Wing Company exists here in Minnesota. It operates out of Red Wing, Minnesota, as you might expect, and it has been a classic work boot for generations. One of the best work boots around. I grew up knowing about Red Wing boots. And so these kids who are in Minnesota, of course, had to acquire a pair of Red Wing boots. But I did a lot of research and I couldn't come up with what would these kids have paid for these Red Wing boots. So I called Red Wing, the Red Wing Shoe Factory, spoke with a wonderful woman there who did the research for me and gave me the answer. So of course I had to acknowledge her.
That's great. I love that. Yes. I learned a lot reading this book.
I learned a lot researching this novel.
It's also very, very visual. So I'm sure you get this question all the time. I just have to ask, are any plans to film it?
We're in negotiations right now.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Thank you. I've also been approached by Broadway to do a musical. We'll see how that works.
That's exciting. Well,
we'll see.
Wow. Did you ever see Big River?
You know, that has been recommended to me, and I have not.
It's great. It's great. That's of course what I'm thinking of. So how have you been doing during this shutdown and COVID, and how is your outlook and your creativity, and how are you working during this time?
I have to tell you honestly, I have been incredibly productive during the pandemic.
Good for you.
My usual routine is to get up at a little before 6 in the morning, get dressed and go to a coffee shop where I'll spend the first 2 or 3 hours writing. I've exchanged my kitchen counter for the coffee shop, but I still get up same time and spend 2 or 3 hours writing. My wife, I'm married to a lovely woman who has promised that she will stay in bed every morning until I finish. But it's working out pretty well. Yeah, so I have to say it's going. And I have talked to a number of other writers who are finding it true for them as well. And I think it's simply because all of the distractions, so many of the distractions are gone now, and we can really focus.
Yeah, good. What are you reading?
We should get to some questions here in just a minute.
Yeah, I'm waiting for Jennifer to come on.
Okay, Jennifer, are you listening?
Jennifer, if you're listening.
I am reading a novel by. Most of my reading these days is of what are called ARCs, advanced readers copies, or bound galleys of novels that won't be out for quite a while, but I've been asked to read them for a dust jacket quote. And I'm reading really right now a fine novel that you won't see for maybe a year. It's called The Land. And it's by just a fine writer here in Minnesota, a guy named Tom Altman. And I'm going to give it a really good blurb because I really like it.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. I just want to say you do have this lovely author's note at the end of the book. And this is how you end it. You say, as the narrator, Odie O'Banion, freely admits near the novel's end, some of what I've told you is true. The rest, well, let's just call it the bloom on the rose bush. And I just wanted to tell you that was so very Mark Twain to me when I read that. So many things are reminiscent, but he used to call those embellishments embroidery. And I thought that I always loved that term. And I loved that that's how you ended that book, probably without knowing that he was so in love with those little embellishments too. That
and nobody embroidered.
A little pet name for them. So I thought that was really sweet. So thank you so much. I know Jennifer probably has wonderful questions from our watching audience.
The audience has been enthusiastic and asking questions. And I'm so sorry. I was waiting patiently to be invited back on screen.
I'm so sorry.
But I was fascinated. I didn't want that to end. So let me start. There are so many good questions. I'm going to start with one from Jacqueline Fritzinger, who wants to know about The Wizard of Oz and L. Frank Baum and his influence on your writing. And we're happy to share at the Mark Twain House. We know there are other authors who influence people.
Yeah. I should talk about two things. I'll talk about Frank Baum, and then let me talk about Mark Twain, how he particularly influenced this novel. I'll have to be perfectly frank with you. I didn't see the Wizard of Oz thing until a reader pointed it out to me. Oh my God! It just went right over my head. But of course, we have several kids on a journey, each of them looking for something different. Mm-hmm. We have this tornado that destroys so much. We have the Black Witch. Thinking, oh my God! Of course, it's there. But the truth about writing is that so much of it occurs on a subconscious level. And what comes up and what you put on the page, you're not always aware where it comes from until someone points it out to you. So, of course, I love The Wizard of Oz, but I wasn't thinking of that at all as I was writing the story. But I was definitely thinking about Huck Finn. Yeah. So here's Huck Finn. When I was in the 5th grade, toward the end of that year, our teacher read to us The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. She did it by reading half an hour after lunch every day. And I loved The Adventures of Tom Sawyer because here was this kid who was just like me, and he was having these great adventures on the Mississippi River. And after that, of course, I had to read Huck Finn, and I loved that novel as well. And ever since I became a writer, I have wanted to write an updated version of Huckleberry Finn. And I took a couple of whacks at it, just couldn't sink my teeth into it. Until when I came out of that dark period writing that manuscript that just didn't work, I realized there was a structure to this story that I could use that someone else had already created. And it was another epic journey that I loved as a kid that my father made me read, the Odyssey. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to structure this story in a way that will have these kids experience many of the same kinds of adventures that Odysseus experienced on his journey from Troy back to Ithaca. And so it was the inspiration of Mark Twain and the structure of Homer, and apparently the subconscious
Wizard of Oz
that created the novel.
Oh, that's great.
Well, so following up on that, Josh, who is actually one of our historic interpreters at the Twain House, wants to know, do you have any personal identification with Samuel Langhorne Clemens beyond, Mark Twain, the author whose novels you love? And I will say, as a person who's in the know, and we take this very seriously at the Twain House, we love that it's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and just Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, with no the. Do you identify with Sam Clemens as well as with Mark Twain, the author?
Well, Sam Clemens spent a lot of time on rivers, like Betsy, as did I. So rivers, our love of rivers certainly run very deep, very long.
Yep.
The thing I love about Twain is all of his wisdom is couched so very often in humor, and mine isn't. I kind of hit people over the head with it. But Twain would put a bullet between your eyes and make you laugh while he was doing it. So I admire that. Aside from that, I like wearing white in the summer.
That's great.
Close enough. We have a really interesting question from Denise, who says, do you think the geographic expanses of the Midwest contribute to a more contemplative outlook than our beloved but heavily forested New England? What do you think?
That's an interesting speculation, and I guess I have to say I agree with it. I love Midwest literature, stories that are set in the Midwest, because really they rise out of an understanding of the land, this relationship to the land. And maybe it's the broad expanses, because I still remember when I was a kid in the Midwest, sitting on the roof of our garage, actually, when I lived on a farm, watching storms come forever across these flat fields.
Mm-hmm.
You could see forever. And so maybe the contemplative aspect of the Midwest certainly contributes to a ruminative kind of story. So I love, for example, the work of Marilynne Robinson, who writes out of Iowa. And her National Book Award winning, I think it was the National Book Award winning novel, Gilead, which is such a beautiful novel of the Midwest. Kent Harroff, if you know his work, he's a little farther west. He's the plains of eastern Colorado. But the plains, they give you this broad perspective. It's not the end of the earth, but you can see it from there, as they say. So I have to agree. I think that it is the nature of the Midwest that lends itself to these contemplative, ruminative kinds of stories.
And that's fascinating.
One more thing about the Midwest. I know you probably love the Northeast. I don't think you love the Northeast as much as those of us who live in the Midwest love the Midwest.
Well, that's fascinating, because that dovetails with what I was about to say, which is that we in the Northeast, particularly those near New York City, I think tend to think we're the center of the universe.
Oh, sure. Yeah. We're the great flyover here.
Well, thank you for opening our eyes. Let's see who else has a question. A lot of people wanted to know about the film version. So Marilyn Spielberg wants to know, it seemed to me that the young boys and girls were much more mature and wiser than the youth of today. Do you think that's true, and was that typical of the era in which this Tenderland was set?
Oh, I think any generalization you make about any age group is not accurate at all. There are certainly very wise young people among us. In some ways, they lead us. I think about the young people who led us after the shootings at the high school in Florida, and the wisdom that they and the insight that they offered us, and that unfortunately we have not yet embraced as a nation. But these kids coming out of the Depression, certainly, and any child coming out of extreme circumstances is going to have a different view, maybe a wiser view than those who live in a protected environment, for example. So as I was writing the story, I knew that these kids are going to have an awareness that may seem more mature for their age. But I thought, no, I think this is appropriate for where they've come from, who they are, what they've been given. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking by it.
That was a really good answer. And it struck me too that I wonder, I marveled at the resourcefulness of the young characters, not just, in their thinking, but their ability to do things and solve practical situations throughout their journey. And I kind of actually wondered, if I were in that situation, I would not know how to do half the things that they knew how to do, at least collectively. So I enjoyed that.
Well, I have to tell you, I was a Boy Scout for many, many years, just shy of an Eagle. And so a lot of the things that I learned in the Scouts, I put to good use when I wrote about these kids' experiences. Practical things.
I'm glad somebody asked about that, because that really is an important part of the novel.
Yeah. Do you know
another important part?
I just want to say this. Odie O'Banion, Odysseus O'Banion, is, he's the Odysseus character. And if you remember your Iliad and your Odyssey, Odysseus is, he's a leader of men, but he's a guy who would rather do things the smart way than, go straight at the enemy. It's just like, well, you can get yourself killed doing that. Oh, did you hear the thunder?
Yeah. Here it comes.
Yeah. So I better get off here pretty quick before I get electrocuted.
Oh my goodness, we don't want that.
No. So Odysseus is really wily, and in the Odyssey, he uses all his wiles and all his resources to get himself and his men, his crew, out of trouble time and again. And that's Odie. And Odie is just really resourceful in
and he's a risk taker. I think all these kids brought something different. Like if any of them had journeyed alone, they would never have done it. But together as this band, they each brought something to save the day on different days.
Yeah, right. We talked about the journey, the river as a metaphor. And the river, one of the things that the river as a metaphor is the journey of family. And across the course of this epic journey, these four disparate individuals form a family. They create family, which was one of the things I wanted to talk about in the novel. Mm-hmm. And they wouldn't survive but for family.
Yeah.
Well, I have two more questions I'm going to throw up, because they're both very good ones from our audience. Jacqueline, again, Fritzinger, says, I have highly recommended this tender land to my husband, my 15-year-old daughter, and my 85-year-old parents, because your writing transcends the generations. Was this your intent? If yes, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to write a book anybody could read. So I was fairly careful about the language I used. Although it deals with prostitution and bootleg and murder and kidnapping.
Yeah.
It deals with it in a very delicate way. Yeah, I with both This Tender Land and Ordinary Grace, I wanted to write a book that could be recommended in high schools for readers. That grandparents would feel comfortable reading to their kids, that whole families could embrace. That really was one of the goals that I set out to meet. when I composed the manuscript, and I'm glad to hear that that's the effect that it's had.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That somebody just out of the blue asked that question, and it ended up being something you really had intentionally focused on. So one more question. This is from Tracy Santor, asking about the Native American aspect of your book, and your connection with that culture. We talked about it a little bit, but is there anything you want to add about your appreciation for, or understanding of, or the extent to which you were influenced and continue to be influenced by Native American culture?
Sure, that's a really good question. I've been researching, writing about creating relationships within the Native community for more than 2 decades now, and this is what I've come away with: an incredible admiration for people who we tried our best as a white ruling majority population to eradicate. We did our best to kill them, to destroy their culture, to steal their children, and yet here they are. Their sense of humor never fails to amaze me. Their resilience is admirable. The way they hold tenaciously to their culture and to their work on preserving their cultures and their language is, we all ought to admire them. And and the other thing that I have taken away from my work with the Native community is a profound awareness of the deep spirituality that is involved in those who really embrace their heritage and their culture. It's powerful, and it's beautiful to see.
Yeah, what a great answer. I don't know that we can top that for I just have to say, so months and months ago, Betsy came to me and she said, "Oh my goodness, I read this wonderful novel, This Tender Land. You've got to get this guy, William Kent Krueger." I was like, "Oh, we just got him." And here you are talking with one another. What a great evening. I've enjoyed it so much, and I think everybody else has. And I'm so grateful to you both for sharing this time with us. Is there anything either of you wants to say before we sign off?
I just want to say, thank you, Jennifer, for facilitating all of this, making it happen. And Betsy, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your preparation for this. Your preparation it's not always the case when I talk to someone. And you were just so stellar. I so appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just feel so honored to have gotten an opportunity to talk to you. It really, really means a lot, because this book meant a lot to me, and I appreciate it. And I had fun talking to you tonight, and I know our audience did. I keep seeing the comments on the side flying by, and thank you, Jennifer, for letting me talk to you. And we hope you will come visit in person at some point. Come see the house.
We know what to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Please do. I
look forward to that.
And Betsy, as I was saying beforehand when we were in the green room, you've done such a great job on this. We're going to ask you to do it again. So we'll look forward to that. And Kent, please do put it on your calendar for some vague, distant time, hopefully not too distant. We want to have you come and tour Mark Twain's house and spend some time with us here in Hartford. In the meantime, thank you both so much.
Thank you.
It was a lovely evening, and I hope the thunderstorm leaves you unscathed and just it's something you can enjoy instead. All right. Thank you. Good night. Thanks everybody for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.